Hello everyone and welcome to my virtual lecture called A Brief History of Brass with a spotlight on Barnsley and Rotherham. So, brass I think is one of the most underappreciated metals that helped make up Britain and indeed the world's metalworks economy. But let's start off with a very simple question. What actually is brass? How is it made? So, brass is a man-made alloy of zinc and copper, although calamine brass was used early on. Brass is made by melting copper, then adding zinc, in roughly 2/3 to 1/3 ratio respectively. Copper is at least 99.3% pure to avoid impurities and unwanted materials, although lead is sometimes added for specific purposes. The amount of zinc affects properties of the brass. Brass is non-corrosive, sonorous, and highly malleable, meaning it is sought after for things that are often prone to corrosion, friction, and used for specific shapes, such as hinges, bearings, ammunition casings, and one of the most popular, of course, instruments. It's commonly found in instruments because it's sonorous and malleable to very specific shapes, but also just looks nice. Bronze is different as it is an alloy of copper and tin, and bronze is generally stronger but less malleable. It's believed brass was first made by accident. The Bronze Age lasted from around 3300 BC to 1200 BC, and the Neolithic period, literally meaning new stone, lasted from around 4300 BC to 2000 BC. It was in these two periods that brass was first being made, but perhaps not always on purpose. Zinc and iron ore were very much alike, and they sometimes didn't realise they were using zinc, not tin or other types of ores. Bronze was being made in Syria from around 3000 BC, and brass was being made accidentally from that period as well. It's believed that a rudimentary form of brass called calamine brass was being formed as early as 10,000 BC, although most estimates put brass as being first created in around 5000 BC, but still a very long time ago, longer than some of the more notable metalworks and other industries that we commonly associate with Barnsley and Rotherham, and indeed metalwork industry today. Calamine is impure zinc carbonate rich in silica. It has been found in Europe, specifically in areas such as Belgium, Germany and what we call the Low Countries, Asia such as India and China, and even North America. Around 20 BC, Mediterranean traders were using brass deliberately for things such as coins and utensils. The Greeks used orichalcos, as they called it, as they didn't have a name for brass, and it simply meant brilliant and white copper, and was a type of calamine brass, thus impure. The Romans were also using brass for things such as armour, for example. Of course, one of the most well-known and still used today purposes of brass is of course brass instruments, specifically the trumpet. The trumpet is considered one of the oldest of the brass instruments, having been dated back to around 1500 BC, notably in Egypt. Again, this could have been done by accident, as Egyptians used a lot of copper and bronze. Brass was being used in churches and such for monuments and sculptures as we venture into the Middle to Modern Age. Brass production properly began in Europe in the Middle Ages, especially in Belgium, Germany and the Low Countries. It was mainly centred around the Meuse Valley, as water was used for the hammer that would fashion brass sheets into the desired finished goods. In fact, it became a huge part of that economy. Brass became the material for luxury items, ranging from ornaments to buckles, with harder metals being used for the more demanding uses, such as tools or weapons. The brass products were then exported across the world, although brass was already being utilised in many different places such as Asia and Scandinavia. With the improvement of technology, brass became more readily available and of better quality. In the late medieval and towards the Renaissance period, foundries in cities became more commonplace as trade developed. Despite the fact that this period of time was struck with various ills such as plagues, the development of science allowed brass making to be done on a larger scale, by more people, and for more purposes. This included smaller workshops to make gift items and such for local markets. Foundries would generally consist of furnaces and crucibles to melt the metals to make the brass, a casting mould to fashion the melted brass together, and a workshop. The advent of the Industrial Revolution meant that brass, along with pretty much everything else, could be mass-produced at a faster and generally cheaper rate. Not only was this owing to the inventions such as the hot rolling mill and the increased access to materials such as coal, it was also that brass became more sought after. It was being used in all places commonly associated with the Industrial Revolution, such as steamships and factories, particularly in places where its anti-corrosive abilities were quite in demand. This was in places such as clocks and navigation systems, in which it was actually very useful thanks to its malleability, usually useful for small parts. It was still being used in non-essential ways too, ranging from ornaments to dustpans, and this was especially popular in the 1800s. Brass became even more useful in the First World War, but for a much different and much deadlier purpose. Ammunition shells, grenades, and in vehicles, boilers and board ships, the brass became an important part of the industrial war effort. Then in the Second World War, the slogan, "Save brass to make bullets," meant that a lot of cap badges were being made out of plastic instead of brass. Coal and steel played a big part of the industrial side of the war effort in both wars, as well as the social and industrial development of Europe and indeed other parts of the world. However, brass was a big part of this as well, and in fact predates the use of coal and steel worldwide. The UK, however, has a bit more of a complicated history of brass. South Yorkshire, and indeed the UK as a whole, somewhat struggled to develop its own independent brass industry initially for multiple reasons. But the main reason for South Yorkshire was the lack of availability of necessary resources. Zinc ore was not in abundance and was not really found that close to what we call South Yorkshire today, not even in calamine form, and logistics were not advanced enough to provide transport to South Yorkshire in the Middle Ages. Other reasons included lack of demand, lack of technological processes and technology in general, and that South Yorkshire had a bigger focus on other industries, most notably coal. Brass from the 1300s can be found in Westminster Abbey, but this brass was imported from some of the aforementioned countries such as Germany, ones that had access to water and calamine, and had independent brass industries. In the late 1500s, the Mineral and Battery Works Company in England had the monopoly on brass wiring, which was vital to the woolen industry. In fact, this one company had the monopoly on calamine mining and brass production in general, while the Mines Royal Company held the monopoly on copper mining and smelting. This had led to a vast amount smuggled in from mainland Europe, as well as outrage in Parliament and from the people. In 1689, these monopolies were revoked, providing a somewhat slower start stimulus to brass production in the UK. Brass production in the UK was heavily reliant and thus heavily centred around areas that had access to copper, calamine and water. Thus the brass industry was shaped more by geographical factors than anything else. It wasn't until the 1700s did brass really start to take off in the UK. As such, the centres of coppers and brass were Swansea, Bristol and Birmingham. Swansea, the city centre we see here, had developed a copper industry in the 1600s, but it really took off in the following 2 centuries. Swansea had access to water and to an abundance of coal. The River Towie was where a lot of the furnaces were built, and access to water was paramount to the industry. Furthermore, copper was shipped to Swansea from Cornwall, so it wasn't very far away, and incidentally, Swansea became central to the global copper industry for around 200 years. Swansea accounted for approximately 50% of the world's copper output in the mid-1800s, drawing trade from across the globe ranging from South Africa, South America to Asia. Calamine was both of notable quality and quantity from Somerset, in particular around Shipham, which at one point had 100 lead and calamine mines. Mendip calamine was particularly famous and could provide enough usable calamine to meet demand. Owing it to its location, both as a port and locality to copper, coal and calamine, Bristol was an economically sound place for brass manufacturing. The slave trade, easily accessible through Bristol's ports, meant that demand for brass was high, but it also had internal and other international customers. An example is Salford Brass Mill, established in the Avon Valley, with access to water and river transport, meaning the movement of materials and finished products was easy. Birmingham became the centre of the brass industry in the mid-1800s thanks to William Champion. In 1738, William Champion patented a way of extracting zinc from calamine via distillation. As a result, Britain's brass industry, particularly in Birmingham, flourished, and brass became one of the many industries that made up the British industrial economy in the 1800s. Owing to the abundance of other industries, most notably coal and steel, along with limited access to resources, South Yorkshire, which was historically the West Riding, did not have such a strong brass industry. It did have one though. Moreover, it had one that affects both Barnsley and Rotherham today. Barnsley's brass foundry is one of desperation and/or capitalistic opportunity rather than one of genuine need, convenience, or real logical sense. Rotherham and Barnsley didn't have extremely local or easy access to calamine, copper, or zinc ore. Similarly, they did not have as good logistical access, such as the access to the water like Swansea, as the other brass centrals did. There was access to the Dearn and Dove, River Don and the River Rother, and with the logistical development during the Victorian period, with the increased usage of trains for example, meaning that transport was improved, their access to sources of necessary materials was far limited in comparison to previously mentioned places such as Bristol. Finally, there wasn't the same level of infrastructure available or prioritised for brass that there was in other areas that depended on brass for their local economy. If anything, it seems kind of a miracle that Barnsley and Rotherham actually had some brass production at all. This is almost complementary to the two areas, as it seems the two areas got brass production based off access to resources if limited, kind employers coupled with a willing workforce, infrastructure that could be used to make brass, the knowledge to make brass, and land that was both available and able for industrialists to build upon. In particular, whilst access to transport was not as good as, say, the port cities, a common quality of the North is that one that still survives today is cheapness. These qualities are what made Barnsley and Rotherham powerhouses when it came to other industries. Access to resources for Rotherham and Barnsley were more local, however, than some might think. Calamine was available in Cheshire. The Cheadle Copper and Brass Company, although only active from 1717 to 1852, proved that the brass industry could be more active than some might think in more northern areas, as the materials nearby weren't exactly as close as, say, Swansea, but they could still get access to them. The access in question, the access to South Yorkshire, was actually quite well established between Cheshire and the other counties, as the salt trade from Cheshire had encouraged strong travelling links between Cheshire and South Yorkshire. In fact, some routes and even pubs, such as the Pack Horse Inn in High Green, were created solely for this trade, but nonetheless gave way to easier transport between both places. Derbyshire, North Yorkshire and Teesdale, all with lead mining industries which required calamine and zinc, had mines that had access and got zinc ore from their mines. Millclose Mine in Derbyshire, Mill and Moor in North Yorkshire, and several lead mining companies that exploited Teesdale mines all got zinc ore for their respective lead mining industries. Most importantly, however, is that in the 1800s, zinc from abroad became more readily accessible and was generally cheaper. This actually led to deprivation and poverty in areas dependent upon the calamine and brass industries. Nevertheless, it proved that the vital materials were increasingly available for Barnsley and Rotherham, and with the aforementioned increase and improvement in logistics, it meant that those materials could get to them. Barnsley and Rotherham were lucky to have kind landowners and and industrialists as employers, most significantly in the 1700s and 1800s. A fine example of this is of course the Fitzwilliams of Wentworth Woodhouse. Although they demanded loyalty, their employees employed high wages, good accommodation, and inclusion in the stately activities such as feasts and parties on the Wentworth Woodhouse estates. Much like famine follies were built to keep local poor people in employment, the brass industry was carried out, in Barnsley especially, mainly to keep industry and employment alive once other industries had failed. Given the other industries required buildings and indeed machines similar to ones required for brass making, it is no surprise that industrialists either had the buildings that could be used or access to the knowledge of how to make them. Furnaces, for example, were a key part in iron making as well as brass making, and iron making was prevalent in Rotherham and Barnsley as well as northern Sheffield. Similarly, the cost of land in Yorkshire was generally lower than in other areas. Furthermore, land was also close to important transport links, both within and outside of Rotherham and Barnsley. Doncaster became a huge part of the train industry in the mid-1800s, providing connections to other parts of the country for goods, people and resources. Barnsley in particular had strong transport links especially in and within industrial areas, with a prominent case being the Thorncliffe-Elsicker tramway. This was a route that linked the Thorncliffe Ironworks, nearby collieries, Tankersley Ironstone Pits, the Milton Ironworks, Elsicker Ironworks, and finally the Elsicker Canal Basin. This route carried materials and finished goods between industrial sites and culminated with finished products being shipped down the Elsicker branch of the Dearne and Dove Canal towards the Humber Estuary and other places along the way. Similarly, Rotherham's link with the River Don meant that there was a commercial benefit to establishing businesses and industries in these two areas, specifically places that had access to these water navigation parts. So, Barnsley and Rotherham had prospects for brass production at least. As I've mentioned, however, Barnsley's brass production was more to do with dwindling circumstance rather than genuine opportunity. Barnsley's main brass production, nay its only brass production, came from the closure of the Milton Ironworks in Hoyland. The Milton Ironworks were built by 1798 and got their name from the Viscount Milton, son of the Earl Fitzwilliam. They were originally owned by the Walker and Company of Rotherham until the 1820s. Following this, the Milton Ironworks changed hands multiple times. During their time of operation, they made a significant amount of iron products, notably bridges, including one for Mauritius. In fact, a lot of these bridges were made and moved in the open, making it quite a public local spectacle. This, coupled with the fact it employed a lot of local people, meant it was a big part of the community and economy, along with Elsicker Ironworks. The first recording of brass production here was in 1877, while it was still an ironworks, as making brass could be done using the same machines and infrastructure as iron. Plus, it would have added to the profits, and it seems that items such as pipes were made. Following the decline of the iron industry, the ironworks ceased production in 1884, and a lot of the buildings were destroyed. This made a similar but sadder spectacle for local people, as it was also the death knell of the local employer and local industry. The Milton Ironworks retained some buildings, which were then leased by Thomas Ashworth to make Milton Foundry. Thomas Ashworth came from Hemel End, Hebden Bridge, and made his living doing mill repairs, including that of brass, hence his interest in Milton. Milton Foundry, established by 1898, produced brass and was Barnsley's only native source of brass in its entire history. It made things such as bearings, but it was short-lived and faced problems. In 1900, for example, they were reprimanded for not paying the correct wages in accordance with local council guidelines. Despite this, business seemed to be flourishing somewhat in 1902, with a new boiler and chimney being installed. Ultimately, however, the company went into liquidation in 1905, and by the 5th of December, all parts had been auctioned off, and brass was no more in Barnsley. Brass was allowed and indeed only really made in Barnsley for the convenience of a former ironworks that had enough of the buildings and machines still in place, such as furnaces, that made establishing a brass foundry here feasible for an industrialist. Rotherham, however, had a much more established brass industry. Unlike popular belief that there were only two prominent brass companies, with one especially prominent brass company, there were actually at least 9 brassworks in Rotherham. First recorded brass company was, like in Barnsley, also involved in iron. This company was called Kirk Kidgel & Co. They were iron and brass founders and made finished products such as spades and shovels, but were best known for their stove grates. They were first recorded in 1828, so we can infer that they existed for some time before this, but how long is unsure. A man named Harris Jarvis was reported to have worked in the brass and iron founding business in Rotherham as early as 1822. Their premises were located near where the old post office was, and found between the marketplace and the River Don. As aforementioned, water was needed for manufacturing, and the access was needed for shipping off and into factories. Thus, with the market nearby where they could sell wares, this made it an ideal place. It was owned by Samuel Kirk and William Kidgel, which is how it got its name. Unfortunately, their industry was short-lived as they closed in 1830, owing to poor business. Their foundry was later taken over by Yates of Yates and Haywood in 1838, who carried on the work of iron founding, and specifically stove grates. There was also the simply and aptly titled Masborough Brassworks. Much like Kirk Kidgel & Co., these started out as iron founders, first set up by George Ragg in the 1820s. After his partnership dissolved, he moved into a brass foundry in Rotherham. It seems his brass empire disappeared in the 1870s, and this may be owed to the fact that other brassworks, indeed most other brassworks, started to really take off in this decade as well. Then there were the Millmore Brassworks, opened up in the 1870s. It was founded by William Heaton, who actually worked at the Masborough Brassworks in the 1860s. Here in 1891, John Henry Kenner suffered an injury to his left eye after pouring molten metal into a mould that then severely burned him, probably due to poor health and safety. Then, in 1915, a fire broke out that affected one half of a 2-storey storage building, resulting in £500 worth of damages, nearly $30,000 in today's money. It was by this time that it had become known as William Heaton & Co. Limited and had moved into iron founding as well. One of their most famous products was a so-called Millmore bath, which had been advertised and sold as late as 1960. The last surviving piece of evidence of the firm. There was also the Effingham Brassworks, which were founded in 1871. It was founded by William Gummer, initially in Kilnhurst. The Gummer family had made their fortune, and indeed helped make Rotherham famous, for making bathroom fittings for the likes of the Shard and the Ritz. William Gummer started Effingham Brassworks with Tom Greenwood, who had worked at Geston Chrimes. George Gummer, William's son, joined in 1875. By 1877, the firm had grown exponentially, and thus they needed larger premises. They settled at Rawmarsh Road in Rotherham town centre. In 1890, William passed the works on to George and his other son, William Guest Gummer. It was at this time it became known as G&WG Gummer Limited. In the early 1900s, they were exporting brass products across the world and on ships, including the speediest ships in the world at the time, the RMS Mauritania. They thrived in Rotherham, helping build the town up and employing hundreds of local people. Ultimately, in 1975, after being taken up by Pentos Engineering, they moved their work to Birmingham, and the works here were no more. There was also the Payne brothers. This consisted of 3 brothers, Charles Jr., James and John. They set up their brassworks in Westgate. Whilst being known for brassworks, they also did gas fittings too. The first example that can be found of their business is from 1859, when they were actually suing a man named Mr. Bainbridge over faulty gas economising burners. In the 1880s, it became run solely by James Payne and became known as Westgate Brassworks. In 1890, his brass workers went on strike over a dispute in wages. His company disappeared in 1900. With a similar sounding name, Baines was another brass works. It was formed in 1856 by William Newbold Baines, officially called the W.N. Baines & Co. Limited, starting out at Millgate, opening its first foundry in 1875, and by 1896 they had moved into the Phoenix Brass Works on Greensborough Road. They were renowned for their patented asbestos-packed water gauges and cocks. They were still active in the 1930s when they played against Gummer's Lot in a game of cricket, with Baines being the victors. Baines was still active in at least 1953. J. Ewell & Co. Limited came directly from Baines, and also from the Effingham Brass Works. Joseph Ewell began his brass career working as a brass chaser for the Effingham Brass Works in 1895. In 1902, he purchased the Millgate Works that once belonged to Baines from the Rotherham Corporation, as they were building Corporation Street. Ewell's biggest contribution to the brass industry included miners' safety lamps and cap lighting. Ultimately, the business closed in 1986, an impressive lifespan, mind you, and then in 1988 they moved their premises to Eastwood. And ultimately, there was the rather succinctly titled Rotherham Brass Foundry Company Limited. This was situated on Water Lane in Westgate. The company was formed in 1886. In 1899, they were reported to have been offering better wages and were challenging the production quality of the brass centre Birmingham, which is then surprising as 2 years later it had a shocking closure. Guest & Chrimes, however, is undoubtedly the most renowned and famous and prominent of all the brass companies in Rotherham's history. Two brothers, Peter and Edward Chrimes, first made a brass foundry near Rotherham Marketplace in 1843. These two brothers were credited with inventing high-pressure, loose-valve, screw-down taps. They then moved into valves, water meters, and possibly one of their most famous products, fire hydrants. When John Guest joined in 1847, it got its name Guest & Chrimes, changing its names from the Chrimes brothers. It moved to its new and permanent location in the centre of Rotherham in 1857 after their business really took off, mainly thanks to a huge order from Spain. They hosted a brass workers' festival and the lecture hall in the Mechanics Institute, in which apprentices and their parents, workers and their families, and all in between were invited to a feast. However, no alcohol was allowed. Much like other brass works in Rotherham, it was not without hardship. Owing to a lot of their riverside locations, these factories, and many others, were the victims of mass flooding in 1880. It has to be said, however, that most of South Yorkshire suffered from flooding, and thus a lot of other places and businesses in and around Rotherham, and a lot of other industries in South Yorkshire in general, were badly affected. Then, in 1890, there was a dispute in Rotherham, specifically within the brass industry, over wages not being raised. There was a march of hundreds of people through the town centre, all apparently quite orderly. They were there actually marching towards Guest & Chrimes. Guest & Chrimes, however, seems to be a double-edged sword when it came to this issue. They appeared to pave the way by being the first to raise their employees' wages, but then refused to negotiate with anyone, including other firms. Nevertheless, the dispute reached an amicable resolution, and thankfully, unlike a lot of industrial disputes in the South Yorkshire area, it never got violent, and the brass industry could continue. There is a common story in Rotherham that the Guest & Chrimes company made the iconic fire hydrants for New York City, which is what resulted in the area being named New York, which is in turn how New York Stadium got its name. There are, however, those who doubt it, claiming that the area got its name after a new road built to travel to York was built, called New York Road. Ultimately, however, Guest & Chrimes shut in 1999 owing to a decline in natively made brass, and when the owners also moved to Derbyshire. The Grade 2 listed buildings still stand, but in a poor state, a reminder of an industry that flourished in Rotherham, one that came into the town quickly, but one that fizzled out. Whilst the happy attitude and the togetherness and also the quality of the brass was notable, it just goes to show that not all industry in the area was immune to economic and social factors. The brass industry of Rotherham and Barnsley, especially in Barnsley owing to its very short scale, has often been overshadowed by other industries. Indeed, the same could be said for the UK's brass industry as a whole, which is made even more peculiar considering brass is still an ongoing business in the UK. In fact, you wouldn't be wrong in saying that the worldwide history of brass has often taken a back seat despite its lengthy and important contribution to the story of metal, industry, and every other part of life it touched, ranging from instruments to war. In Elsecar, brass at one point was the second major employer, alongside coal, and in Rotherham in the 1870s there were at least 5 brass works operating. Brass is also overshadowed historically by bronze, despite its colourful and long history. But brass isn't just about bands nowadays, and it still forms a part of everyday life, generally in engineering, mechanics and the sciences, whether we see it or not, and it's been that way for centuries, and probably will for centuries to come.